Okay, so one of the last major things we need to look at is, now that we've derived the aggregate demand curve, is, if we reflect back to chapter 3 when we looked at the regular demand curve, we looked at what causes movements along the curve versus shifts of the curve. And that's one of the first things we're going to do in this chapter, is we're going to look at how shifts versus movements along the aggregate demand curve. And then we're going to finalize that by introducing to you the aggregate supply curve, which also turns to be upward sloping, but we're not going to derive it like we did the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so what we have here then is an aggregate demand curve that is downward sloping. We know it's downward sloping because of the Keynesian cross. Now, we know that that changing the prices changes the AE curve on the Keynesian cross, which then changes this AD curve, but changes it in terms of movements. So the question is why is it the case that there's an inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP? There are three reasons, actually: the real balance effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. Now, I would strongly encourage you, I actually spent a lot of time making this here, but if you look on page 3 and on page 4 of the typed up lecture notes, I think you'll find that rather helpful in terms of going through the steps of what happens. Basically, with the first effect, the real balance effect, basically what we say there is that changing the price level changes the purchasing power of wealth, and that by changing the purchasing power of wealth, people buy different amounts, based on that changed purchasing power. In the interest rate effect, what we say is that changing the price changes the interest rate, and then changes our willingness to purchase stuff. And in the international trade effect, what we're saying is that changing the price level relative to the price level in other countries changes our purchasing power. So in the real balance effect, basically for each of these effects, what we do is we go through a series of steps. For the real balance effect, the one thing we could say is that if the price level falls, then my purchasing power rises, right? I can buy more stuff with a set level of income based on the fact that price levels fell. And if my purchasing power is rising, then my monetary wealth is rising. The amount of stuff I can buy with my wealth is rising. And then I, in turn, buy more stuff. In the interest rate effect, if the price level falls, my purchasing power rises. And in the interest rate effect, we then say it actually takes less money to buy a fixed basket of goods. And because it requires less money to buy a fixed basket of goods, I actually turn out to save more. And as I save more, then the interest rate falls. And as the interest rate falls, people borrow more and firms borrow more. And then finally, in the international trade effect, what we say is that if the price level in the U.S. falls relative to other countries, then U.S. goods are less expensive relative to the rest of the world. And if that's the case, then net exports would rise. Both, in the case of all three of these effects, the real balance effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect, all of those are explaining movements along the curve. Now, that's different than a shift of the curve. We get a shift of the curve when we have the same price level, but we actually change the C, I, G, or NX. So for instance, if I change government spending, and it's the only thing that I change, let's say that I increase it, or if I increase investment, or if I increase net exports, if I increase, or even just consumption as well, if I change any of these components, and let's say I increase them, while keeping the price level the same, that shifts the curve from AD to AD prime. Movements along the curve are the real balance effect, interest rate effect, international trade effect. Shifting the curve caused by changing any of those factors but keeping the price level constant. Okay. Let's now then turn to the short-run aggregate supply function, or the aggregate supply function in general. To keep this rather simple, if you're really interested in this, there's a intermediate macroeconomics you could take where we talk about this much more. But basically, the short-run aggregate supply function is going to look something like this. Now we're calling it short-run aggregate supply, and that's going to be very different than what is called the long-run aggregate supply. Now, why is there a difference between this versus this? Well, the difference really comes about with three main things. That would be sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions. Quite simply, when we say that wages are sticky, what we mean is that they don't move as quickly compared to the price level changing. So if the price level changes, I'm on a year-long contract, right? So I can only negotiate with my employer on a yearly basis my wages, right? And that's how it is for probably most individuals, is that wages basically lag or are slower to change than prices. Same with menu costs. With menu costs, here what we're saying is that it actually, if a firm, let's say, well in this case let's do a direct menu. Let's say I have a restaurant, right, and the price of eggs goes up. I'm not going to immediately change the price in my menu to reflect the changed price in eggs, right? I'll wait a while, see if it's going to stick, and then there's a cost to changing my price, right? I got to get new ones printed. I'm not going to do the whiteout thing, that's so cheap, right? Right, but you could also see that with like catalogs, right? That catalogs, right? If L.L. Bean wanted to change its prices for boots, right, it would be costly because they're going to have to print a new catalog to reflect those changed prices. And then the misperceptions deals with the fact that one has differing levels of knowledge of their own price versus other prices in the economy. Now, that stickiness and misperceptions exist in the short run. But economists basically are going to say in the long run, all of that stickiness and stuff is gone. It's actually vertical at the natural real GDP level. Okay, so when we put all of those things together, right? Well, actually, one other thing here. Movements along the curve are caused by then the stickiness and the misperception. Shifting the curve is going to change, it's going to happen when we change something like the wages, or if we change non-labor inputs, or if there's a supply shock, or if there's a change in productivity. Let's just draw it this way here. I could get my short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left if I increase prices, if I increase wages. I increase the price of non-labor inputs. If I decrease productivity, or there's a negative supply shock. Obviously it would be the opposite, with the opposite of those factors. Okay, so essentially then what we need to do then is put everything all together. Okay, and when we do that, I'm going to watch my time here. Is that we could get something that looks like this. In the long run, all the prices are vertical, there are no misperceptions. Here, there's sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions. And we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve because of the real balance effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. Now, I'm going to stop the video here, and then I'm going to say just a few comments more about what causes these curves to shift.